"You can't dance," the millionaire yelled at the waitress, but she spun him in a way that silenced the entire ballroom. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, what's the most embarrassing thing that's ever happened to you at a formal event? And at the end of the story, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10. Enjoy. The collision was a symphony of chaos set to the elegant strains of a Viennese waltz. One moment, Gabriella Wood was navigating the crowded dance floor of the St. Regis ballroom, her tray of champagne flutes held high with the practiced ease of a professional. The next, a clumsy dancer had stumbled backward into her path. The tray tilted. Time seemed to slow as a golden arc of champagne soared through the air, landing with near-comical precision all over the front of a pristine $1,000 tuxedo. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. The music faltered. Every eye in the opulent ballroom turned to the source of the commotion. Scott Sutton, the billionaire CEO of Sutton Industries, stood frozen, dripping with champagne. The woman he had been trying to impress, a famously aloof heiress named Victoria, looked at the stain on his jacket as if it were a mortal wound. "Oh my goodness, sir, I am so sorry," Gabriella stammered, her face flushing crimson. She quickly set the now empty tray on a nearby table and pulled a cloth napkin from her pocket, dabbing uselessly at the spreading stain. "There was a man. He stumbled. I couldn't." Scott looked down at his ruined tuxedo, then at Gabriella, a waitress in a simple black uniform, and all the frustration of a night spent navigating boring small talk and pretending to be charmed by Victoria coalesced into a single sharp point of fury. "Sorry?" he snapped, his voice a low, cutting growl that carried across the suddenly silent room. "Do you have any idea how much this suit costs? It's more than you make in a year." Gabriella flinched as if he had slapped her. The humiliation was a physical blow. "It was an accident," she whispered, her hands trembling. "An accident of your own making," Scott retorted, his voice rising, playing to the audience of shocked socialites. He gestured dismissively at the dance floor. "You move like you have 2 left feet. You are weaving through the dancers like a clumsy oaf. It's a ballroom, not a battlefield." He took a step closer, his eyes cold and dismissive. "Let me give you a piece of advice. People who work at events like this should be invisible. And if you're going to be on a dance floor, at least learn the basics. But I suppose that's too much to ask. It's clear to everyone here," he announced, his voice ringing with arrogance, "that you can't dance." The words hung in the air, a cruel, public indictment. Gabriella stood there, the center of 100 judgmental stares, her face burning, her heart pounding with a mix of shame and a slow-burning anger. She could feel the pitying looks, hear the snide whispers. Poor girl, how embarrassing. She could have cried, she could have run. That's what he expected. That's what everyone expected. But Gabriella Wood had spent her entire life being underestimated. She had been told she wasn't good enough, wasn't rich enough, wasn't talented enough, and she was done letting other people's opinions define her. She took a slow, deep breath, her spine straightening. The trembling in her hands stopped. She looked up, and the timid, apologetic waitress was gone. In her place was a woman with fire in her eyes. She didn't say a word. Instead, she did something so audacious, so completely unexpected, that the entire ballroom held its breath. She took a step forward, right into Scott's personal space. With a fluid, confident motion, she took his right hand and placed it on her shoulder. She took his other hand, lacing her fingers through his. Her posture changed, her chin lifted, and she shifted her weight with the practiced grace of a professional dancer, assuming her frame. What do you think you're doing?" Scott stammered, completely thrown off balance by her sudden, silent command. Gabriella didn't answer. She just looked him in the eye, a silent challenge passing between them. Then, with a subtle shift of her hips and a firm, undeniable lead, she began to move. It wasn't a waltz. It was a tango. A fiery, passionate, and impossibly complex Argentine tango. She guided him backward with a single, powerful step. He stumbled, completely unprepared for her strength, but her frame was so solid, her lead so clear, that his body had no choice but to follow. She led him into a series of sharp, staccato steps, caminas ochos, her feet a blur of intricate, precise movements. The simple black uniform she wore suddenly seemed irrelevant. It was the way she moved, the story she was telling with her body, that captivated everyone. The orchestra, catching on to the unfolding drama, instinctively shifted their melody, a lone violin picking up a haunting, dramatic tango tune. Scott was no longer in control. He was a passenger in a dance he didn't know, led by a woman he had just publicly humiliated. He could feel the strength in her back, the confidence in her every step. She wasn't just dancing, she was commanding. The crowd, which had been whispering moments before, was now completely, utterly silent, their champagne glasses frozen halfway to their lips. Then came the moment that would be replayed in Scott's mind for weeks to come. As the violin reached a crescendo, Gabriella led him into the center of the dance floor. With a powerful, fluid motion, she executed a perfect gancho, a signature tango move where the dancer hooks their leg around their partner's. Her leg wrapped around his with lightning speed, throwing him slightly off balance. Before he could recover, she used his momentum to spin him. It wasn't a gentle twirl. It was a fast, controlled, and utterly dominant spin that left him momentarily dizzy. And as he came out of it, she dipped him. She dipped him low, her arm, a steel frame supporting his back, her face just inches from his. She held him there for a single, breathtaking second, her eyes locked on his. In that moment, she wasn't the clumsy waitress. He wasn't the powerful CEO. She was the master, and he was the student who had just been taught a devastatingly beautiful lesson. With a final, elegant flourish, she brought him back up, released his hands, and took a single step back. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, not of apology, but of finality. The ballroom was so quiet you could hear the ice melting in the glasses. Then, Gabriella turned, picked up her fallen tray from the table, and with her head held high, walked calmly towards the service doors, disappearing from the room as if nothing had happened. She simply went back to being a waitress. The silence held for another 5 seconds before it was shattered by a single spontaneous sound. Someone in the crowd started to clap, then another, and another. Within moments, the entire ballroom erupted in a thunderous, stunned ovation, not for the CEO, but for the waitress who had just silenced him without saying a single word. Scott Sutton stood alone in the center of the dance floor, his tuxedo still damp with champagne, his mind reeling. He had just been publicly outmaneuvered, outclassed, and utterly captivated. He watched the service door swing shut behind her, a million questions racing through his mind. Who was that woman? His business partner, Mark, came up to him, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and amusement. "Scott," he said, his voice a low whistle. "I don't know who she is, but I think you just lost a dance-off you didn't even know you were in." Scott didn't answer. He just stared at the door, a slow, grudging, and completely fascinated smile spreading across his face. He turned to Mark, his expression now one of pure, focused determination. "Find her," he said. "I don't care what it takes. Find out who she is. I need to talk to her." The morning after the gala was a nightmare of Scott Sutton's own making. He woke up not to the usual silence of his penthouse, but to the incessant buzzing of his phone. By 7 a.m., he had received 23 calls from his PR team, a dozen frantic texts from board members, and one very short, very cold message from Victoria that simply read, "We're done." But that wasn't the worst of it. The worst part was the video. It was everywhere. Titled, "CEO Gets Tangoed by Waitress," the shaky cell phone footage of Gabriella spinning him and dipping him on the dance floor had gone viral overnight. It had millions of views on TikTok, Twitter, and was the #1 trending topic on every news outlet. The comments were brutal and hilarious. He went from billionaire boss to backup dancer in 30 seconds flat. That dip was more devastating than a market crash. Find this waitress and give her a Nobel Prize for services to humility. Scott slammed his laptop shut, a muscle twitching in his jaw. He had spent his entire adult life cultivating an image of untouchable power and control. In less than a minute, a waitress in a cheap uniform had dismantled it all with a single dance move. He was a laughingstock. "Mark," he barked into his phone the moment his business partner answered. "I need a full report on her." Gabriella Wood. "I want to know everything. Where she lives, where she works, where she learned to dance like that. Everything. And I want it on my desk by noon." "Scott, are you sure this is a good idea?" Mark's voice was cautious. "Maybe you should just let this blow over." "No. Scott said, his voice a low growl. This isn't over, it's just beginning. He wasn't sure if he was angry, humiliated, or just intrigued. All he knew was that he couldn't get the image of her out of his head. The fire in her eyes, the steel in her spine, the impossible grace in her every movement. Who was she? The report arrived at 11:45 a.m. It was a thin folder, but what it contained painted a picture that was both simple and deeply complex. Gabriella Wood, 26 years old, lived in a small apartment in Queens with her younger sister, Isabel. She worked 2 jobs to make ends meet: waitress at a diner in the mornings and catering staff for high-end events at night. No criminal record, no significant debts other than the usual student loans. And then, the final page. The one that made everything click into place. Talent, classical and Latin dance, trained at the Fiorello H. LaGuardia High School of Music and Art and Performing Arts. Dropped out of the Juilliard School dance program after her first year due to family financial hardship following her father's death. Younger sister, Isabel Wood, 17, is currently a dance prodigy at the same high school, with aspirations to audition for Juilliard. Gabriella's second job is primarily to fund Isabel's training and private lessons. Scott leaned back in his chair, the papers resting on his desk. The story was suddenly so much clearer. The woman on the dance floor wasn't just a waitress. She was a deferred dream, a world-class talent who had sacrificed her own future for her sisters. The paradox of her, the clumsy waitress and the masterful dancer, wasn't a contradiction. It was a sacrifice. He looked out the window of his 80th floor office, a new, unfamiliar feeling stirring in his chest. It wasn't anger anymore. It was a strange, unsettling mix of respect and something else. Something that felt dangerously like admiration. He picked up his phone and called his assistant. "Cancel my afternoon," he said. "I have a personal matter to attend to." The diner was called The Morning Griddle. It was a classic New York spot. A long counter, red vinyl booths, and the comforting smell of coffee and bacon. It was a universe away from the St. Regis ballroom. Gabriella was in her element. She moved with an efficient, no-nonsense grace, pouring coffee, taking orders, and trading friendly insults with the regulars. She wore a simple blue waitress uniform, her hair tied back in a messy ponytail. She looked tired, but there was a light in her eyes that hadn't been there at the gala. Here, she wasn't invisible. Here, she was known. She was Gabby. Scott sat in his car across the street for a full 10 minutes, just watching her. He felt like an intruder, a man from another world peering into a life he had no right to disturb. He had a plan, a logical, businesslike proposal. But now, seeing her here, so real and so completely out of his league in a way that had nothing to do with money, the words felt hollow and calculated. He finally took a deep breath and got out of the car. The bell above the diner door jingled as he walked in. A few heads turned. A man in a tailored Brioni suit was not a common sight at the Morning Griddle. Gabriella was at the counter, her back to the door, writing down an order. "And for you, Sal, the usual heart attack on a plate," she called out to the cook. "You know it, Gabby," a voice boomed from the kitchen. Scott walked up to the counter and sat down on one of the worn-out stools. "I'll just have a coffee," he said, his voice quieter than he intended. Gabriella froze. She didn't even have to turn around. She knew that voice. She slowly finished writing the order, placed it on the service window, and then turned to face him, her expression a mask of pure, unimpressed disbelief. "You've got to be kidding me," she said, her voice a low, dangerous whisper. "Of all the diners in all of New York, you had to walk into mine." "I was in the neighborhood," he lied, the words feeling foolish the moment they left his mouth. "The neighborhood?" she repeated, crossing her arms. "The closest thing to a Sutton Industries in this neighborhood is a pawn shop. What do you want?" "I came to apologize," he said, deciding that honesty, at least partial honesty, was the best approach. "For the other night, my behavior was unacceptable. I was out of line." She looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his for any sign of insincerity. "Yes, you were," she said finally. "But I've dealt with ruder rich guys. It's practically part of the job description." She grabbed a coffee pot. "You want that coffee, or are you just here to admire the vintage linoleum?" "Coffee would be great," he said, relieved she wasn't throwing him out. She poured him a cup, her movements sharp and efficient. "So, apology delivered. Anything else?" I've got 3 tables waiting for their pancakes. Actually, yes, he said, getting straight to the point. I have a business proposal for you. She let out a short, bitter laugh. A business proposal? Let me guess, you want to invest in my tray-carrying skills? Or maybe you want me to teach a masterclass in professional champagne spilling. I want you to teach me how to dance, he said. She stopped wiping the counter and just stared at him. You what? The Sutton Industries Foundation is hosting its annual charity gala in 2 months, he explained, his tone shifting to the familiar cadence of a CEO outlining a project. It's our biggest fundraising event of the year. The centerpiece of the evening is a dance performance by the sponsors. This year, my main competitor, a man I despise, is a professionally trained ballroom dancer. I cannot, under any circumstances, let him show me up. Gabriella continued to stare, her expression unreadable. I need a private instructor, he continued. Someone who can teach me not just to dance, but to look like I was born doing it. Someone discreet, professional, and the best. He looked her straight in the eye. After the other night, it's clear that's you. She was silent for a long moment, then she started to laugh. Not a small chuckle, but a full from-the-belly laugh that made the cook peek out from the kitchen. You want to hire me, she said, wiping a tear from her eye, to be your personal dance coach so you can beat your rival in a charity dance-off. Essentially, yes. That is the most ridiculous, absurd, and wonderfully pathetic thing I've ever heard in my entire life, she said, still laughing. The answer is no. No? He was genuinely shocked. He had expected her to be difficult, but not to refuse outright. No, she repeated, her laughter subsiding as she crossed her arms. I have 2 jobs, a sister to support, and 0 interest in feeding the ego of a billionaire who thinks it's okay to humiliate a waitress in public. Find someone else. I don't want someone else, he said, his voice intense. I want you. He leaned forward. I'll pay you. Handsomely. Name your price. My dignity isn't for sale, Mr. Sutton, she said, her voice turning cold. She turned to take an order from another customer, dismissing him completely. Scott sat there, stunned. He had been rejected. Not for his money, not for his looks, but for his character. It was a novel and deeply unpleasant experience. He could have walked away. He should have walked away. But the image of her on the dance floor, so powerful and alive, was burned into his mind. And the file on his desk, the one about her sister, Isabel. He waited until she had a free moment. Gabriella, he said, his tone softer now. I read about your sister, Isabel. I know she's auditioning for Juilliard's summer intensive. Gabriella froze, her back still to him. She turned around slowly, a dangerous glint in her eyes. You had me investigated. It was a standard background check, he said, a half-truth. I needed to know who I was dealing with. And now you're going to use my family to manipulate me? She hissed, her voice low and furious. No, he said, his gaze steady and sincere. I'm going to make you a professional offer. The tuition for the Juilliard program, the travel, the living expenses in the city, it's expensive. I know you're saving for it. He took a deep breath. I will pay you, as your professional fee, $50,000 for 8 weeks of dance lessons. She was speechless. $50,000. It was an insane amount of money. It was more than she had saved in 5 years. It was enough to give Isabel her dream without a single worry. It was a lifeline. But it felt like a deal with the devil. It's not charity, Gabriella, he said, as if reading her mind. It's a contract. You have a skill I need. A world-class skill. I'm paying for the best. That's just good business. She looked at him, her mind at war. Her pride was screaming at her to throw the coffee in his face. But the image of her sister's joyful face when she'd told her she might, just might, have enough money saved for the audition, that was a more powerful voice. On one condition, she said finally, her voice tight. He held his breath. Anything. During our lessons, she said, looking him straight in the eye, her power fully restored. You are not the CEO. I am not the waitress. I am the teacher. You are the student. You will do what I say when I say it. You will not be late. You will not complain. And you will learn to dance, even if it kills you. My world, my rules. Do we have a deal? Scott looked at this incredible, fierce, and utterly captivating woman and felt a slow, genuine smile spread across his face. It was the most one-sided negotiation he had ever been in, and he had already lost. Spectacularly. Deal, he said, extending his hand across the counter. She shook it, her grip firm and resolute. "First lesson is tomorrow, 7 a.m. at my studio in Queens. And Scott?" "Yes? Wear something you can sweat in," she said with a predatory smile, "because I am going to make you work." The next morning at precisely 6:55 a.m., Scott Sutton's chauffeured Maybach pulled up in front of a slightly run-down brick building in Queens. The address Gabriella had given him led to a place called the Rhythm Loft. From the outside, it looked less like a dance studio and more like a place you'd go to get a questionable tattoo. Scott stepped out of the car, dressed in what he considered appropriate athletic attire. Brand new, top-of-the-line Lululemon gear that still had the creases from the packaging, and a pair of pristine white sneakers that had never touched anything dirtier than the floor of his private gym. He walked up the creaky wooden stairs to the second floor and found a door with a simple hand-painted sign, the Rhythm Loft. He pushed it open and stepped into a world that was the complete antithesis of his own. The studio was one large, open room. The wooden floors were worn and scuffed from years of dancing, the walls were lined with slightly fogged mirrors, and the air smelled of floor polish, old wood, and sweat. It wasn't glamorous, but it felt alive. It had a soul. Gabriella was in the center of the room, stretching. She wore simple black leggings, a gray tank top, and had her hair pulled back in a tight, professional bun. She looked nothing like the waitress from the diner or the accidental siren from the gala. Here, in this space, she was all focus, all power. She stopped stretching when she saw him, her eyes doing a slow, critical scan of his expensive workout clothes. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. "Well, well," she said, her voice crisp and businesslike. "Look what the cat dragged in. You're 5 minutes early. I'm impressed." "I'm never late for a business meeting," Scott replied, setting his gym bag down. "This isn't a business meeting," she corrected him instantly, walking towards him with the confident stride of someone who owned every inch of the space. "This is my studio, my floor, my rules." She stopped in front of him, crossing her arms. "Out there," she gestured vaguely towards the window, "you're the billionaire CEO. In here, you're just a student, a clumsy, rhythm-impaired student who has a lot of work to do. Got it?" Scott, who hadn't been spoken to like that since he was a teenager, felt a flicker of his old arrogance. But he remembered the deal. He swallowed his pride. "Got it." "Good," she said, her tone all business. "First rule, drop the Sutton attitude. I don't care how much your shoes cost. In here, they're just tools, and right now they're attached to 2 very uncoordinated feet." She pointed to the center of the floor. "Warm up. Let's see what we're working with." What she was working with was a block of marble. Scott was fit, disciplined, and strong from his private training sessions. But he had zero fluidity. His movements were stiff, angular, and completely devoid of rhythm. "Okay, stop," Gabriella said after watching him attempt a simple stretching exercise for 30 seconds. She walked over to him and circled him like a shark assessing its prey. "You move like a robot that's low on battery. There is no music in your body, is there, Sutton?" "I have excellent posture," he said defensively. "You have the posture of a mannequin," she retorted. "Dancing isn't about being stiff, it's about being fluid. It comes from the core, from the hips." She tapped his waist with 2 fingers. "These things, they're not just for holding up your expensive pants. They're supposed to move." She put on some soft, rhythmic Latin music. "Okay, let's try a basic salsa step. It's simple. 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 7, follow me." She demonstrated the step with effortless grace, her hips swaying in perfect time with the music. Scott watched, then tried to imitate her. The result was a clumsy, shuffling march that was completely offbeat. "No, no, no," she said, stopping the music. "You're thinking too much. Stop trying to calculate the steps. You have to feel it." "Feel what? The floor?" "The music, you idiot," she said, rolling her eyes. She walked up to him and, without asking, took his hands and placed them on her waist. "Now, put your hands on my shoulders. Lightly. You're not trying to strangle me." His hands rested on her shoulders, and he was suddenly acutely aware of how close they were. He could feel the warmth of her skin through her thin tank top, smell the faint, clean scent of her hair. His well-ordered, logical brain went completely offline. "Okay," she said, seemingly oblivious to his internal meltdown. "Forget the steps. Just follow me. Feel the rhythm through my body." She started moving again, her hips guiding his, her steps forcing him to follow. For a few seconds, he was a disaster, stepping on her feet, moving stiffly, his body resisting the natural sway of the music. "Relax your shoulders, Sutton," she commanded. "You're holding them up around your ears like you're expecting an attack." He tried to relax. "And breathe. It's dancing, not a tax audit." She was a tough teacher, her instructions sharp and unfiltered. She corrected his posture with a firm push on his back, adjusted his hand placement with a quick tap, and never once let him get away with a lazy step. He was used to being the one in charge, the one giving orders. Being on the receiving end of such direct, unapologetic instruction was a humbling and deeply frustrating experience. "Did you leave your sense of rhythm at the office along with your common sense?" she asked after he stumbled for the 5th time. "My sense of rhythm is perfectly functional, thank you," he grumbled. "Really? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like it filed for bankruptcy," she shot back. Despite the frustration, he found himself smiling. Her insults were sharp, but they were coated in a layer of playful energy that was impossible to truly be offended by. He was working harder than he had in any board meeting, sweating through his expensive Lululemon shirt, his muscles protesting. But for the first time in a long time, he felt present. They tried a simple turn. He was supposed to lead her, but his movements were so clunky and hesitant that she ended up leading him. "No, you're the lead here," she said, stopping. "You have to be decisive. Give me a clear signal. A man who runs a billion-dollar company should be able to lead a simple turn." "It's not as easy as it looks," he said, wiping sweat from his brow. "Nothing worth doing is," she replied, her tone suddenly serious. She looked at him, and for a moment the playful teacher was gone, replaced by the artist. "Dancing isn't about steps, Scott. It's about trust. Your partner has to trust that you will lead her, that you won't let her fall. You have to earn that trust with every move you make." Her words hit him with an unexpected force. Trust. When was the last time he had truly trusted anyone, or had anyone truly trust him? "Okay," he said, his voice quieter now. "Show me again." She took his hand, her touch surprisingly gentle. "The signal comes from your frame, from the pressure here," she said, placing his hand firmly on her back. "It's a conversation without words." They tried again. This time he focused not on the steps, but on her. On the subtle shifts in her weight, the silent instructions her body was giving his. He took a deep breath and led her into the turn. For a single magical moment, it worked. They moved together, a brief, fleeting instant of perfect synchrony. In that moment, they were no longer teacher and student, CEO and waitress. They were just two people, connected by the music, their bodies speaking a language older than words. He looked down at her, at the focused intensity in her eyes, at the small, satisfied smile playing on her lips. And his heart did that stupid, unfamiliar flip again. The moment was shattered when he, emboldened by his small success, tried to add a flourish of his own and promptly stepped on her foot. "Ow!" she yelped, pulling back. "Sorry," he said, his face flushing. She shook her foot, wincing, but then she started to laugh. "Okay, let's not get ahead of ourselves, Baryshnikov. One successful turn doesn't make you a professional." The lesson ended an hour later. Scott was drenched in sweat. His muscles ached and his ego was thoroughly bruised. But he wasn't defeated. "Same time tomorrow?" he asked, packing his bag. "If you think you can handle it," she said, stretching her arms over her head. "I can handle it," he said, a new determination in his voice. He walked to the door, then paused. "And Gabriella?" "Yeah?" "Thank you," he said. She frowned. "For what? For torturing you?" "For showing me," he said, a slow, genuine smile on his face, "that I have absolutely no idea what I'm doing." He left, and Gabriella stood alone in the quiet of her studio, a thoughtful expression on her face. She had spent the morning ordering a billionaire around, insulting his sense of rhythm, and watching him fail repeatedly. And somehow, in the middle of all that chaos, she felt like she had finally seen the real Scott Sutton. The one who, beneath all the layers of power and pride, was just a man trying to learn a new step. And she was surprised to find that she was looking forward to teaching him the next one. The next 2 weeks fell into a pattern of organized chaos. Every morning at 7 a.m., Scott Sutton, the titan of industry, would arrive at the Rhythm Loft and transform into Scott Sutton, the world's most uncoordinated dance student. Gabriella, in turn, would transform from a friendly neighborhood waitress into a ruthless drill sergeant in leggings. "Hire Sutton? Lift your frame. You look like a wilting flower," she'd bark, physically adjusting his posture. "My arms are getting tired," he'd complain, his face beaded with sweat. "Oh, I'm sorry. Did the billionaire forget how to use his muscles? Drop and give me 20 push-ups. Now." He would drop and do the push-ups, grumbling under his breath, while she counted with a merciless rhythm. Their banter became a language of its own, a mix of sharp insults, playful teasing, and a growing undercurrent of mutual respect. He was still clumsy, but he was no longer stiff. He was trying, he was listening, and he never, ever missed a lesson. The change wasn't just happening in the studio. Scott found himself thinking about Gabriella outside of their lessons. He'd be in a high-stakes board meeting and would suddenly remember the way she'd laughed when he'd tried to execute a hip roll and almost thrown his back out. He'd be dining at a 5-star restaurant and would find himself wishing he was eating a greasy burger with her at the morning griddle. Gabriella, for her part, found it increasingly difficult to see him as just the arrogant CEO from the gala. She saw the exhaustion in his eyes from his long workdays, the quiet determination to master a simple step, and the way he'd listen intently when she talked about her sister, Isabel. He was still a billionaire from another planet, but he was becoming a surprisingly human one. The breakthrough came during a particularly grueling rehearsal. They had been practicing a lift for the waltz, a move that required perfect trust and timing. Scott, ever the perfectionist, was getting frustrated with his inability to get it right. On the third failed attempt, he almost dropped her. "Okay, that's it. Break," Gabriella said, her voice a little shaky as she stepped away from him. She grabbed a towel and a water bottle, her own patience wearing thin. Scott slumped on the floor, leaning against the mirrored wall, his head in his hands. "I can't do this," he muttered, his voice a low growl of frustration. "It's impossible. I look like a fool." Gabriella sat down a few feet away from him, taking a long drink of water. "You don't look like a fool," she said, her voice softer now. "You look like someone who's learning. There's a difference." He let out a short, bitter laugh. "You don't understand. I can't fail at this, not with him." Gabriella frowned. "Him? You mean your rival, Julian Croft?" She had Googled him after their first conversation. Julian Croft was a charismatic, self-made tech billionaire, famous for his philanthropy, his good looks, and his near-professional skills on the ballroom dance circuit. "What's the real story between you two?" she asked, her curiosity getting the better of her. "This isn't just about a charity event, is it?" Scott was silent for a long moment, staring at his reflection in the mirror. "We were at Harvard together," he said finally, his voice quiet and raw. "He was the golden boy, effortlessly brilliant, charming, popular. I was the legacy kid. The one everyone assumed was only there because of my family's name. I had to work twice as hard to prove I belonged." He looked at her, and for the first time she saw not the powerful CEO, but a man haunted by an old insecurity. "There was a girl," he continued, "my first real love. I was planning to propose. The night I was going to do it, at a university gala, I found her with him, with Julian. He was a better dancer, a better talker. He was better." He looked away, the memory still a sharp, painful wound. "She told me I was too stiff, too serious, that I didn't have any soul. And then she left with him." Gabriella's heart ached for him. The story was so simple, so human. It wasn't about business or money. It was about a broken heart. "So this gala," she said softly, "it's not about beating him. It's about proving to myself that I'm not that same stiff, soulless kid anymore," he finished for her, his voice barely a whisper. "It's pathetic, I know." "No," she said, her voice firm. "It's not pathetic, it's human." She moved closer, sitting beside him on the floor. And for what it's worth, she was an idiot. Anyone who can't see the soul in someone who works this hard, they're the one who's blind. He looked at her, surprised and deeply touched by her fierce, unexpected defense of him. The silence between them was no longer awkward or professional. It was intimate, a shared space of vulnerability. "And what about you?" he asked, wanting to shift the focus from his own pain. "Why do you work so hard? The 2 jobs, the long hours. It's not just for the money, is it?" She sighed, her own mask of the tough teacher slipping away. "It's for Isabel," she said. She's She's the real dancer in the family. I was good. She's brilliant. She was born with music in her bones. She smiled, a sad, proud smile. When our dad died, everything fell apart. My mom had to work 2 jobs, and I dropped out of Juilliard to help. But I made a promise to myself. I promised I wouldn't let Isabel's dream die just because ours did. She looked at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. She has her Juilliard audition in 3 months. It's her one shot. Everything I do, it's for that, so she can have the future I couldn't. Now it was his turn to be humbled. He had been so wrapped up in his own petty rivalry, his own bruised ego. And here was Gabriella, a woman who had given up her own world-class future, working her fingers to the bone, not for herself, but for her sister. That's, he began, but he couldn't find the right word. That's the most honorable thing I've ever heard. They sat in silence for a long time, 2 people from different worlds who had just discovered they were fighting the same battles, the battle to prove their worth, the battle to protect the people they loved. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment, before gently covering hers. "You're an amazing woman, Gabriella Wood," he said, his voice a low, sincere murmur. She looked down at his hand on hers, then up at his eyes. The air in the studio was thick, with a new, more potent energy. The teacher and the student were gone. There were only 2 people, a man and a woman, who had just seen into each other's souls. The next day, Scott didn't just show up for his lesson. He showed up with a small, unassuming envelope. "What's this?" Gabriella asked, her guard instantly up. "If it's a check, I don't want it." "It's not a check," he said, handing it to her. "Open it." She opened it cautiously. Inside were 2 tickets. Not just any tickets. They were front-row center tickets to see the American Ballet Theater's sold-out production of Don Quixote that weekend, featuring a guest performance by Paloma Herrera, Isabel's lifelong idol. Gabriella stared at the tickets, her jaw dropping. How did you get these? They've been sold out for months. I tried to get them for Isabel's birthday." "I know a guy," he said with a shrug, though they both knew a guy meant he had probably called the chairman of the Lincoln Center. I thought Isabel might like to go." Gabriella was speechless. It wasn't about the money. He could have just given her cash. This was different. This was thoughtful. He had listened to her, had understood what truly mattered to her, and had used his power not to impress her, but to give a gift to her sister. "And," he added, a little nervously, "I got a 3rd ticket, for a friend, if she wants to bring one." He was giving them a private moment, not trying to intrude. It was the most respectful and most romantic thing anyone had ever done for her. "Thank you, Scott," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. This means more than you can imagine." "You're welcome," he said, his own heart feeling lighter than it had in years. Their lesson that day was different. The teasing was gentler, the touches lingered a little longer, the space between them was charged with a new, unspoken intimacy. He was still clumsy, but she was more patient. He was still a student, but she was starting to see him as something more. They were in the middle of practicing the waltz, his hand resting firmly on her back, her hand on his shoulder. They were moving together, a little awkwardly, but they were moving. The music swelled, and for a moment they were just 2 people, lost in the melody. He looked down at her, she looked up at him, and the world seemed to stop. It was in that moment of perfect, fragile connection that the studio door swung open. Well, a smooth, arrogant voice said, dripping with condescension. "Trying to learn a new trick, Sutton, or just proving you still can't?" Julian Croft stood in the doorway, impeccably dressed in a casual but clearly expensive outfit. He leaned against the doorframe, a cruel, mocking smile on his face, his eyes sweeping over Scott's clumsy posture and then landing, with appreciative interest, on Gabriella. "And who," he said, his smile widening, "is your very lovely and very brave teacher?" The moment the studio door clicked shut behind Julian Croft, the charged energy in the room seemed to deflate, leaving behind a heavy, suffocating silence. Scott stood frozen in the center of the floor, his fists clenched at his sides. The mocking echo of Julian's words, "Don't embarrass yourself, Sutton," played on a loop in his head. He had faced hostile takeovers and ruthless negotiations without flinching, but the casual, condescending cruelty of his old rival had stripped him bare, leaving him feeling like that same insecure college kid all over again. "Hey," Gabriella's voice was soft, pulling him from his spiral of self-recrimination. She was standing a few feet away, her arms crossed, her expression a mixture of sympathy and a fierce, protective anger. "Don't listen to him," she said. "He's a jerk." Scott let out a short, humorless laugh, running a hand over his face. "He's not just a jerk, Gabriella. He's a jerk who can actually dance. Did you see the way he moved? It was flawless." "It was robotic," she retorted instantly. Scott looked at her, surprised. "What?" "He was perfect." "He was technically perfect," she clarified, walking closer to him. "Every step was precise, every line was clean. It was like watching a perfectly programmed machine. But there was no soul in it, Scott. No joy, no heart." She stopped in front of him, her gaze intense and unwavering. "He was performing. You," she poked a finger gently into his chest, "are learning to dance." Her words were a lifeline. He had been so focused on his own inadequacy that he hadn't seen the difference. Julian was showing off a skill. Gabriella was teaching him an art. "He has no heart?" Scott repeated, the idea slowly taking root. "None," she confirmed with a confident nod. "I danced with him. It felt like dancing with a beautiful, expensive statue. There was no connection, no conversation. When I dance with you," she hesitated, a faint blush rising on her cheeks. "It's a mess. You step on my feet, you forget the count, and you have the hip movement of a filing cabinet." "Thanks," he said dryly. "But," she continued, her voice softening, "I can feel you trying. I can feel you listening. There's a connection. It's clumsy and awkward, but it's real. And I would rather dance a clumsy, real dance with heart than a perfect, empty one any day." He stared at her, completely disarmed. She wasn't just his teacher anymore. She was his defender, his partner. The fierce loyalty in her eyes was a balm to his bruised ego, a shield against a lifetime of insecurity. "So," he said, a slow, genuine smile finally returning to his face. "I have the heart of a dancer, but the feet of a filing cabinet?" "Exactly," she said, her own smile returning. "But don't worry, we can work with that. Filing cabinets are sturdy, they're reliable." She winked. "And with a little oil, even they can learn to move." The tension broke, replaced by a comfortable, shared laughter. The ghost of Julian Croft was exorcised from the room, and all that was left was the two of them. "Okay, Professor Wood," he said, his voice lighter. "What's the next lesson for the filing cabinet?" "The next lesson," she said, her tone turning all business again, "is that we are going to work so hard that by the time that gala comes around, Julian Croft won't know what hit him." She clapped her hands. "From the top. Waltz frame. And this time, try to look like you're dancing with a woman you like, not like you're being audited." The dynamic of their lessons changed after that day. The teasing was still there, but it was layered with a new, deeper level of support. She pushed him harder than ever, demanding perfection in every step, but her criticisms were now laced with encouragement. He, in turn, stopped fighting her instruction and started to truly listen, to trust her guidance completely. Their world became the studio. They met every morning, the rising sun casting long shadows on the worn wooden floors. He'd arrive with coffee for both of them. He'd learned she liked hers with a splash of oat milk and one sugar. She'd have a playlist ready, a mix of classical waltzes, fiery tangos, and upbeat salsa that he was slowly, painfully learning to navigate. The studio was their bubble, a place where he wasn't a CEO and she wasn't a waitress. They were just Scott and Gabby, a man learning to let go and a woman teaching him how. But the outside world had a way of intruding. One afternoon, Scott was in his office, his mind still on a particularly difficult tango sequence, when his assistant buzzed him. "Sir, your fiancée Victoria is on line 1. Scott froze. He hadn't spoken to Victoria since she'd sent the curt "we're done" text. He had been so consumed with Gabriella and the dance lessons that he had almost forgotten about the woman he was supposed to marry. "Put her through," he said with a sigh. "Scott, darling." Victoria's voice was like honey-coated steel. "I was so surprised to see you've become an internet sensation, tangoed by a waitress. How utterly rustic." "What do you want, Victoria?" he asked, his tone flat. "I just wanted to call and offer my condolences. For your dignity, of course, and to let you know that Julian and I will be attending the charity gala together. He's agreed to be my dance partner for the sponsor's performance. Isn't that wonderful? We'll have to make sure we don't show you up too badly." The threat was clear. It wasn't enough for Julian to have stolen his first love. Now he was parading around with his ex-fiancée, ready to humiliate him on the biggest social stage of the year. "Thank you for the warning, Victoria," Scott said, his voice dangerously calm. "I'll be sure to practice." He hung up, his hand clenching the phone. The old, familiar rage was back, cold and sharp. He was still stewing an hour later when there was a soft knock on his office door. "Come in," he barked. The door opened and Gabriella peeked her head in. She was holding a brown paper bag from the morning griddle. "Hi," she said, a little hesitantly. "I was in the neighborhood for a catering consultation, and I thought you might have forgotten to eat lunch." She walked in, placing the bag on his desk. The greasy, comforting smell of a bacon, egg, and cheese sandwich filled the sterile, corporate air. It was the most out-of-place and most wonderful thing he had seen all day. He looked at her simple waitress uniform, at the genuine concern on her face, and the anger inside him just dissolved. "You came all the way to Midtown to bring me a sandwich?" he asked, his voice softer than he intended. "Well, I couldn't have my star student fainting from low blood sugar before our lesson, could I?" she said with a playful smile. "It would be bad for my reputation as a ruthless dance instructor." He smiled, a real, tired smile. "Thank you, Gabby. You have no idea how much I needed this." She looked at his face, at the tension in his shoulders. "Bad day at the office?" "You could say that," he said, unwrapping the sandwich. He took a bite, and the simple, honest flavor was a grounding force. Victoria called. Gabriella's smile faded. "Oh, she's going to the gala, with Julian," he said, staring at the sandwich as if it held the secrets to the universe. Gabriella was silent for a moment, then she pulled up a chair and sat down across from him. "So what?" she said, her voice firm. He looked at her, surprised. "So what?" "Gabriella, he's a professional-level dancer. She's probably a perfect partner. They're going to humiliate me." "Only if you let them," she said, leaning forward. "Scott, who cares about Julian Croft? Who cares about Victoria? This was never about them. This was about you. This was about you proving to yourself that you're not that same kid from college. You've already done that. You're showing up every single day. You're working, you're sweating, you're learning, you're facing the thing that scares you. That's the victory. The gala is just the after-party." He stared at her, the truth of her words cutting through his anger and fear. She was right. He had been so focused on the finish line, on the public performance, that he had forgotten about the journey. "And besides," she added, a mischievous glint returning to her eyes, "Julian may have technique, but we have a secret weapon." "We do?" "Of course," she said, tapping her temple. "We have me. And I have a plan." She stood up, her energy infectious. "He's expecting you to do a waltz. Something classic, elegant, boring. He's going to come out and do a technically perfect, soulless performance." She started pacing, her mind clearly buzzing with ideas. "We're not going to do that. We're going to do something they will never, ever expect." "And what's that?" he asked, now intrigued. She stopped and looked at him, a slow, predatory smile spreading across her face. "We're going to do a salsa," she said. "A fast, fun, and fiery salsa. We're not going to try to beat him at his own game. We're going to change the game entirely." A laugh escaped him, a sound of pure, surprised delight. It was a crazy, audacious, and completely brilliant idea. It was pure Gabriella. "You think a filing cabinet can learn to dance salsa in 6 weeks?" he asked, a grin on his face. "I think," she said, her eyes sparkling, "that this filing cabinet is about to become the life of the party." She walked to the door, then turned back. "Oh, and Scott?" "Yes?" "You owe me for the sandwich delivery," she said with a wink. "I'm charging you double for emotional support services." He laughed as she walked out, feeling lighter than he had all day. The threat from Julian and Victoria was still there, but it no longer felt like a looming execution. It felt like a challenge. And for the first time, he had a partner to face it with. If Scott thought learning the waltz was humbling, learning to dance salsa was a full-blown ego demolition. Gabriella had transformed their 7 a.m. lessons into a fiery boot camp of Latin rhythm, and Scott's body was an open rebellion. "Sutton, what is this?" Gabriella asked on the third day, stopping the music and putting her hands on her hips. She was trying to teach him the basic side-to-side step, and he was moving like a man trying to discreetly stomp out a small fire. "Are your hips made of concrete? Did you forget to oil them this morning?" My hips are perfectly functional, he said, wiping sweat from his brow. They're just strategic. They don't make unnecessary movements. Unnecessary movements? She repeated in disbelief. Scott, it's salsa. The entire dance is an unnecessary movement. That's the point. It's supposed to be fun, fluid, a little bit cheeky. She demonstrated the move again, her own hips swaying with a natural, effortless rhythm that was both mesmerizing and deeply intimidating. See? It's a conversation. Your feet say hello and your hips say, and how are you doing today? My hips are saying, please, for the love of God, make it stop, he grumbled, but he tried again. Their days fell into a new, more intimate routine. The formal distance required by the waltz was gone, replaced by the close, kinetic energy of salsa. To teach him the proper frame, she had to stand closer, her hand on his shoulder, his on her back. To teach him to lead, she had to let him guide her, which often resulted in them stumbling into each other in a clumsy laughing heap. The studio became their sanctuary. Inside those four walls, the world of boardrooms and diners and viral videos ceased to exist. They were just Scott and Gabby, a clumsy student and his mercilessly witty teacher, slowly, awkwardly, and undeniably falling for each other. The talk about his past humiliation and her family's struggles had broken down a crucial barrier. Now, their conversations during water breaks were no longer just banter. They were real. He told her about the crushing loneliness of his childhood, of growing up with a father who measured love in stock prices. She told him about her father, a musician who had filled their tiny apartment with music and taught her that a person's real wealth was the joy they created in the world. He used to say that dancing was just thinking with your body, she said one morning, her eyes soft with memory. That's why I love it. It's the one place where my head can finally shut up and my heart can speak. He looked at her, at the passion that radiated from her when she talked about her art, and felt a profound sense of admiration. He had spent his life acquiring things, companies, properties, art collections. But Gabriella, she created things. She created joy, she created music with her movements, she created a space where a stiff, emotionally constipated billionaire could, for a few hours a day, feel human. The true test of their evolving relationship came on a Saturday afternoon. Gabriella had to cancel their lesson to take her sister Isabel to a preliminary audition for a local dance company. Scott, finding himself with an unexpectedly free morning and an undeniable urge to see her, did something impulsive. He drove to Queens. He found them outside the dance academy, Gabriella giving Isabel a last-minute pep talk. Isabel was a younger, more fragile version of Gabriella, with the same fiery eyes but a layer of teenage anxiety that her older sister had long since shed. "You've got this, Izzy," Gabriella was saying, straightening the collar of her sister's leotard. "Just breathe, and remember what Dad used to say." "Think with my body," Isabel finished, a nervous but determined smile on her face. Scott stayed in his car watching from a distance, feeling like an intruder. He saw the deep, fierce love between the two sisters, the weight of a shared dream resting on their shoulders. When Isabel went inside for the audition, Gabriella was left alone on the steps, her posture radiating a nervous energy that was so different from her usual confident command in the studio. Scott took a breath and got out of the car. "Fancy seeing you here," he said, his tone casual. She jumped, startled. "Scott? What are you doing here?" "I was in the neighborhood." He lied again, but this time they both knew it was a lie they were happy to share. "Thought I'd see how the future of American dance was doing." She smiled, a real grateful smile. "She's a nervous wreck, so am I." They sat together on the steps, a comfortable silence between them. He didn't ask about the audition, he didn't offer empty platitudes. He just sat there with her, a quiet, solid presence. "Did you, get the tickets I sent?" he asked after a while, his voice a little hesitant. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide. "The tickets? The ones for the American Ballet Theater? That was you?" He gave a small, almost shy shrug. "I know a guy." "A guy?" she repeated, her voice full of awe. "Scott, those tickets were impossible to get. Isabel she cried. She said it was the best gift she's ever received." She looked at him, her heart in her eyes. "How did you even know she loved Paloma Herrera?" "You mentioned it," he said simply. "During one of our lessons, you said your dad took you to see her once." She was speechless. He had remembered. A tiny throwaway comment she had made weeks ago, and he had not only remembered it, he had acted on it. He had used his immense power not to show off, not to control, but to give her sister a piece of a dream. "Scott," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "thank you." "It was nothing," he said, though the look in her eyes told him it was everything. Isabel came out an hour later, her face glowing. "I got a call back," she squealed, throwing her arms around Gabriella. "Izzy, that's amazing," Gabriella cried, hugging her sister tightly. Isabel then noticed Scott standing there, a quiet, happy smile on his face. "Oh, hi," she said, a little shyly. "You're the guy from the ballet tickets, aren't you?" Before Scott could answer, Isabel threw her arms around him in a spontaneous, grateful hug. "Thank you so much. It was the most incredible night of my life." Scott, who was used to formal handshakes and polite nods, was momentarily startled, but then he relaxed, patting her back awkwardly. "You're very welcome, Isabel. You deserve it." As Isabel chattered excitedly about the audition, Gabriella watched Scott. He wasn't the intimidating CEO anymore. He was just a man, looking slightly uncomfortable but genuinely happy, being thanked by a starstruck teenage girl. And her heart did a painful, beautiful squeeze. She was in trouble. Deep, irreversible, and wonderful trouble. The salsa lessons intensified. The closer they got to the gala, the more demanding Gabriella became. But now the physical contact that was once a source of awkwardness had become a language of its own. His hand on her back was no longer just for posture. It was a point of connection. Her hand on his shoulder was no longer just for guidance, it was a source of grounding. One evening, they were practicing a particularly complex sequence of turns. The music was fast, the rhythm infectious. They were moving in sync, a blur of motion in the mirrored room. He led, she followed, their bodies in a constant, fluid conversation. For the first time, he wasn't just executing steps, he was dancing. The music ended, and they found themselves standing in the center of the room, breathless, their faces inches apart, his hand still on her waist, hers on his shoulder. The playful energy was gone, replaced by a raw, undeniable tension. He could see the pulse beating in her throat. He could smell the faint, clean scent of her skin. She could see the question in his eyes, the same one that was screaming in her own mind. "Gabby," he whispered, his voice a rough murmur. He leaned in slowly, his gaze dropping to her lips. She didn't move, she didn't breathe. This was it. The moment that had been building for weeks in every shared laugh, every vulnerable confession, every accidental touch. Their lips were about to meet when the loud, jarring ring of the studio's landline phone shattered the moment. They jumped apart as if they'd been electrocuted. I should get that," Gabriella stammered, her face flushed as she rushed to the old phone on the wall. Scott stood in the middle of the floor, running a hand through his hair, his heart pounding with a mixture of frustration and a longing so intense it was a physical ache. "Hello? The Rhythm Loft," Gabriella said into the phone, her voice a little too high. She listened for a moment, her expression shifting. "Yes, this is she?" "Oh, yes, of course. I understand." She hung up the phone, her back still to him. "Who was it?" he asked, his voice still hoarse. She turned around slowly, a strange, unreadable expression on her face. It wasn't the look of a woman who had just been about to be kissed. It was the look of a woman who had just received bad news. "That was the catering company for the gala," she said, her voice flat. "They had a last-minute cancellation. One of their waitresses called in sick." She took a deep, shaky breath. "They asked if I could fill in." The silence in the studio was absolute. The bubble they had built, their sanctuary of music and movement, had just been violently burst. In an instant, she wasn't his partner, his teacher, his equal. She was a waitress, and he was the billionaire CEO. The real world, with all its cruel, unyielding classifications, had just come crashing back in. "You don't have to do it," he said, his voice tight. "Yes, I do," she said, her own voice turning cold, distant. She looked at her simple studio, then at him, and he saw the wall go back up, higher and thicker than ever before. "I need the money, Scott. My sister's dream isn't cheap." She walked over to her bag, her movements now sharp, professional. "Lesson's over for today. I'll see you tomorrow." She walked out without another word, leaving him alone in the studio, the echo of the salsa music now a mocking reminder of a connection that had felt so real, and had just been proven to be so fragile. The next morning's lesson was a study in Arctic frost. The easy warmth and playful banter that had come to define their time together were gone, replaced by a cold, brittle professionalism. Gabriella was all business, her instructions clipped, her corrections impersonal. She didn't call him Scott. She called him Mr. Sutton. Mr. Sutton, your frame is collapsing. Keep your elbows up. Mr. Sutton, you're anticipating the turn. Listen to the music. Mr. Sutton, that was late. Again. Scott's own frustration grew with each correction. He wanted to break through the wall she had put up. He wanted to tell her that her working as a waitress didn't change a thing about how he saw her. But he knew words were useless. His initial humiliation of her at the first gala had been public and verbal. Any apology he made now in the privacy of her studio would feel small and insufficient. He was clumsy, distracted, and by the end of the hour, they were both on edge. "Let's just stop for today," Gabriella said, turning off the music abruptly. "We're not making any progress." "Because you've put a wall up so high, I'd need a grappling hook to get over it," he shot back, his frustration finally boiling over. "A wall?" she retorted, her eyes flashing with anger. "You want to talk about walls? What about the one that separates your world from mine? The one that means you get to be an honored guest at a gala, and I get to be the one serving you drinks. That wall seemed pretty solid to me yesterday." "That's not fair, and you know it," he said, stepping closer. "I don't care about any of that." "Don't you?" she challenged. "It was easy for you to see me as your equal in here, in my world. But the second we were reminded of the real world, you froze. You looked at me like I was the help again." Her words hit him like a physical blow because he knew, on some level, she was right. He had been so caught up in his own feelings. He hadn't considered how that phone call must have felt for her, a stark, brutal reminder of the power imbalance that had defined their first meeting. He took a deep breath, the anger draining out of him, replaced by a profound, aching regret. He had messed up. Again. "You're right," he said, his voice quiet and raw. "I'm sorry. Not for the situation, but for my reaction. For making you feel, even for a second, like you were anything less than my partner." He looked her straight in the eye. His own vulnerability a stark contrast to his usual CEO armor. "When you're in the studio, you're the boss. When we're at the diner, you're the witty waitress who knows everyone's life story. When you're on a dance floor, you're a goddess. You're 100 different brilliant things, Gabby. Being a waitress at a party doesn't diminish any of that. It's just one more part of the incredible woman you are." She stared at him, her own anger softening, disarmed by the raw sincerity of his apology. He wasn't trying to fix it with money. He was trying to fix it with understanding. "But I still have to work the gala," she said, her voice a near whisper. "I know," he said, "and I will respect that. I won't try to get you out of it. I won't interfere." He gave her a small, sad smile. "But I will be cheering for you, silently, from the head table." The lesson ended, but the wall between them had begun to crumble again, replaced by the fragile scaffolding of a new, more honest understanding. The night of the Sutton Foundation Charity Gala arrived with the weight of 1,000 expectations. The grand ballroom was even more opulent than the one at the St. Regis, a breathtaking spectacle of crystal, gold, and the concentrated wealth of New York City. Scott stood in a receiving line, shaking hands and making polite small talk, his eyes constantly scanning the room. He spotted Julian and Victoria holding court near the bar, looking every bit the golden couple, their laughter loud and confident. Julian caught his eye and gave him a small, mocking nod, a silent message. "The stage is set for your humiliation." Scott's jaw tightened, but he forced a neutral expression. His gaze kept drifting towards the service doors, his heart a tight knot of anxiety. And then he saw her. Gabriella emerged from the kitchens, carrying a tray of hors d'oeuvres. She wore the same simple black uniform, her hair pulled back in a neat bun. She moved through the glittering crowd with a quiet, professional grace, her face a mask of polite neutrality. She was, as she had been at the first gala, invisible, and it broke his heart. Their eyes met for a fleeting second across the crowded room. He gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod of support. She responded with a tiny, brave smile before turning to offer a canapé to a senator. The evening was a slow-motion torture for Scott. He had to sit at the head table, flanked by the mayor and a visiting duchess, and pretend to be engaged while every fiber of his being was focused on Gabriella. He watched as she moved tirelessly around the room, refilling glasses, clearing plates, all while Julian and Victoria preened for the cameras, their every move a performance of effortless superiority. The inevitable confrontation happened near the end of the main course. Gabriella was clearing plates from a table near the dance floor. As she leaned over to pick up a plate, a voice dripping with saccharine venom cut through the air. "Do be careful with that, dear," Victoria said, loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear. "We wouldn't want another accident, would we?" Gabriella froze, her back to Victoria. She slowly straightened up and turned to face them, her expression unreadable. Julian was sitting beside Victoria, a smug, amused smirk on his face. "I heard you're the entertainment tonight, Sutton," Julian said, his voice carrying. "Let's hope your partner has a better sense of balance than your waitress." The insult was deliberate, public, and designed to humiliate them both. A few people at the nearby tables snickered. Gabriella's face remained a blank mask, but Scott could see the slight tremor in her hand as she held the stack of plates. She was holding it together, but she was hurting. And in that moment, something inside Scott snapped. The quiet, calculated anger he had been nursing for weeks erupted into a clear, cold, and absolute fury. This wasn't about a college rivalry anymore. This was about a cruel, petty man and woman trying to break the spirit of the strongest, most honorable person he had ever known. And he was not going to let it happen. He stood up. The mayor, who was in the middle of telling a story, stopped mid-sentence. The entire head table turned to look at him. Scott didn't say a word. He just walked down from the dais, his steps calm and deliberate, and made his way across the ballroom, directly towards Julian and Victoria's table. The room, sensing a drama far more interesting than the planned speeches, grew quiet. He stopped in front of their table, his shadow falling over them. He didn't look at Julian, he didn't look at Victoria. He looked at Gabriella. "Excuse me," he said, his voice clear and ringing through the silent room. He gently took the heavy stack of plates from her hands and set them on the table. "You're done for the night." "Scott, what are you doing?" she whispered, her eyes wide with shock. He ignored her, turning his attention for the first time to a stunned Julian and a smirking Victoria. "Julian," Scott said, his voice dangerously soft, "you've always believed that the world is a stage and we are all just actors playing for an audience. You thrive on the applause, the admiration. You believe that appearances are everything." He then gestured to Gabriella. "This woman, Gabriella Wood, has spent her life working behind the curtain. She's not an actress, she's real. She has more talent in her little finger than you have in your entire perfectly choreographed body. She has more integrity in one honest day's work than your entire family has in a century of inherited wealth." Victoria gasped, her face a mask of outrage. Scott wasn't finished. He turned to address the entire captivated ballroom. "Many of you were at the St. Regis Gala 2 months ago," he said, his voice now resonating with power. "You saw me humiliate this woman after she accidentally spilled a drink on me. It was an arrogant, disgusting display of privilege, and it was one of the most shameful moments of my life." He looked at Gabriella, his eyes full of a raw, public apology. "What you didn't see was what happened next. She didn't cry, she didn't complain. She stood up to my arrogance and taught me a lesson in dignity that I will never forget." He took Gabriella's hand, his fingers lacing with hers. "For the past 2 months, this incredible woman has been teaching me how to dance. But she's taught me so much more. She's taught me that strength isn't about how much money you have, but about how much you're willing to sacrifice for the people you love. She's taught me that a person's worth isn't measured by their job title, but by their character." He pulled her gently towards the empty dance floor. "Tonight I was scheduled to perform a dance to impress you all, to prove that I could be as polished and perfect as my rival." He looked directly at a now pale Julian. "But I'm no longer interested in that competition." He turned to Gabriella, his world narrowing to just her. "Gabriella," he said, his voice now an intimate murmur that the entire room strained to hear. "I am not your student tonight, and you are not a waitress." He took her other hand, bringing her into a perfect dance frame. "Tonight, you are my partner, and I would be the most honored man in the world if you would dance with me." The orchestra, catching the cue as if by magic, began to play a soft, romantic melody. And in front of the entire silent and utterly captivated high society of New York, Scott Sutton led Gabriella Wood onto the dance floor. It wasn't a flashy salsa. It wasn't a technical waltz. It was a simple, heartfelt dance. A quiet conversation between two people who had found each other in the most unlikely of ways. He wasn't a perfect dancer, and she wasn't wearing a ball gown. But as they moved together, in perfect, easy harmony, they were the most beautiful couple in the room. Julian and Victoria sat at their table, forgotten, their public humiliation complete. They had tried to create a scandal, and instead, they had become the unwilling witnesses to the birth of a legend. The story of the billionaire who had publicly sacrificed his pride to honor the heart of a waitress. As the final soft notes of the melody faded, the ballroom seemed to hold its breath for a collective heartbeat. Scott and Gabriella stood in the center of the dance floor, his hand still resting on her back, hers on his shoulder. The world around them was a blur of out-of-focus lights and silent, staring faces. In that moment, there was only the two of them. Then, the applause began. It wasn't the polite, measured clapping of a society event. It was a roar, a thunderous, heartfelt ovation that washed over them, a wave of public affirmation for the raw, honest truth they had just displayed. Scott looked down at Gabriella, a slow, brilliant smile spreading across his face. A smile of relief, of victory, of a love so profound it had given him the courage to tear down his own world. "So," he murmured, his voice for her ears only, "how did the filing cabinet do?" She laughed, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy that was more beautiful than any music. "You were perfect," she whispered back. "Perfectly clumsy, perfectly real, and perfectly mine." He squeezed her hand. "Let's get out of here," he said. He led her through the parting crowd, ignoring the calls of his name, the frantic questions from reporters who had suddenly materialized, and the furious, impotent glare from Victoria, who was now just a forgotten footnote in a much grander story. He didn't stop until they were outside, in the cool, clean air of the New York night. He hailed a taxi, a simple yellow cab, and gave the driver an address in Queens. "Where are we going?" Gabriella asked as the city lights streaked past the window. "To the only place that makes sense," he said, taking her hand. "We're going to our studio." The rhythm loft was dark and quiet when they arrived. The moonlight streamed through the large windows, casting long shadows on the worn wooden floors. It was their sanctuary, the place where a CEO and a waitress had shed their labels and found each other. They stood in the center of the room, the silence between them no longer awkward or tense, but filled with a deep, comfortable intimacy. "Gabby," Scott began, his voice suddenly thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. He turned to face her, taking both of her hands in his. "That first night at the St. Regis, I was a jerk, an arrogant, privileged fool who saw you as nothing more than an inconvenience." "You were," she agreed, but there was a soft, forgiving smile on her face. "And then you danced," he continued, his eyes searching hers in the dim light. "And in 30 seconds, you turned my entire world upside down. I've spent my whole life being in control, building walls, calculating every move. And you just waltzed right through all of it." He took a deep breath, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm that had nothing to do with salsa. "For the past 2 months, I've been trying to learn how to dance. But what I've really been learning is how to live. How to be vulnerable. How to trust. You haven't just been my teacher, Gabby. You've been my salvation." Tears were now streaming silently down her cheeks. "I stood up on that stage tonight and I talked about my legacy," he said, his voice a low, passionate murmur. "But the truth is, I don't care about the Sutton name. I don't care about the company or the galas or what any of those people think." He brought her hand to his chest, placing it over his heart. "This is the only legacy I care about. The one we're building. Together." He slowly knelt down on one knee, right there on the scuffed floor where they had stumbled and laughed and slowly fallen in love. He pulled a small, velvet box from his pocket. "Gabriella Wood," he said, his voice shaking with the weight of the moment. "You are the most incredible, honorable, and fiercely alive woman I have ever known. You are the music my soul was missing. I am hopelessly, completely, and forever in love with you." He opened the box. A simple, elegant ring sparkled in the moonlight. Will you do me the honor of being my partner in dance and in life? Will you marry me? She was sobbing now, a happy, beautiful mess. Yes, she whispered, her voice choked with tears. Yes, you foolish, wonderful man. Of course, yes. He slid the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit. He stood and pulled her into his arms, and their kiss was a culmination of everything: the spilled champagne, the clumsy steps, the shared secrets, the public triumph. It was a kiss that sealed not a contract, but a lifetime. The wedding was a perfect reflection of them. An elegant ceremony at the New York Public Library, followed by a reception where the stuffy orchestra was promptly replaced by a fiery salsa band. Their first dance was not a choreographed waltz, but a spontaneous, joyful salsa that had all the guests, from senators to Sal the cook from the morning griddle, cheering on their feet. Julian Croft and Victoria, having become social pariahs after the gala, were not invited. They faded into the background of New York society, their story a cautionary tale about the perils of underestimating a waitress with a will of steel. Isabel, with her tuition and expenses fully covered by Scott's anonymous scholarship, had not only been accepted into the Juilliard Summer Intensive, she had been offered a full 4-year scholarship, her talent too bright to be denied. But Scott and Gabriella's greatest joint venture was the one they launched 6 months after their wedding: the Wood Sutton Foundation for the Arts. It was an organization dedicated to providing funding and mentorship to gifted young artists, dancers, and musicians from low-income backgrounds. Kids who, like Gabriella, had the talent, but not the means. Gabriella served as its executive director, her passion and real-world experience making it one of the most effective arts charities in the country. One crisp autumn evening, Scott came home to their beautiful, warm, and decidedly unminimalist brownstone in Brooklyn. The sound of a child's laughter echoed from the living room. He walked in to find Gabriella on the floor, attempting to teach their 1-year-old son, Daniel, a basic salsa step. The little boy, who had his mother's fiery eyes and his father's clumsy feet, was giggling as he stumbled around. "Look out, world," Scott said, leaning against the doorframe with a loving smile. "Another filing cabinet in the making." Gabriella looked up, her face glowing with a happiness that was deep and real. "He's got your rhythm," she teased. Scott walked over and scooped his son into his arms, kissing his chubby cheek. He then leaned down and kissed his wife, a long, sweet kiss that tasted of home. "No," he said, looking from his son to the love of his life. "He's got our rhythm." He sat on the floor with them, pulling them both into his arms. The powerful CEO, who had once been terrified of being seen as a fool, was now happily playing on the floor, surrounded by the beautiful, chaotic music of his family. He had been taught a new dance, one of love, vulnerability, and joy. And he knew, with a certainty that was as solid as the ground beneath him, that he would spend the rest of his life perfecting the steps. What did you think of Scott and Gabriella's journey from a disastrous spill to a perfect partnership? On a scale of 0 to 10, how would you rate their story? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And for everyone who has stayed with us until the very end, who believes that the best dance partners are the ones who teach us how to live, please comment happily ever after. We are so grateful to share these stories with you. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for more narratives that will change the world.